Hello, I'm Elijah Rose, the soldier turned historian, and today we're going to clear up some misconceptions about Galileo Galilei. And of course, to start with, I will assume everyone here has heard about him in science, high school science class. The first misconception is that his heliocentric theory of the universe was revolutionary. Well, he was actually building upon the work of Kepler, who spent many decades on this subject trying to rectify the theories of the planets to their observed motion in the sky. And when he died of old age, he was working on the working theory he had was the planets orbit the sun and the sun orbit the earth. Galileo simply took that one step further with the theory that the earth was a planet orbiting the sun. The, the second misconception was that Galileo was the first to come up with this. There was an ancient Greek philosopher named Aristarchus who proposed that the Earth and planets orbit the sun. The objection at the time was that the stars exhibited zero parallax shift, and the Earth moved around the sun. We should be able to see the stars change position in the sky. Of course, the truth is the parallax of the stars is only detectable with a telescope since they are unimaginably far away. But perhaps the biggest misconception about Galileo is that he opposed superstitions and or the church. First off, Galileo never left the church. In fact, he is said to have gotten his ideas about pendulums while distracted from his prayers watching a chandelier swing back and forth at church. Second is Galileo was not immune to the superstitions of his time. Astronomy at the time was one and strained with astrology, and Galileo took payment to give horoscopes. Specifically, the Austrian Field Marshal Albrecht von Wallenstein consulted Galileo when hiring subordinates for his alleged crusade against German Protestants. It should be also noted that it is unclear how seriously Galileo took his own horoscopes. But likewise, Galileo was not an uber genius, and sometimes he was mistaken. Specifically, he thought the comets were not physical bodies, but just atmospheric effects. Of course, the most common misconception was that his theories were opposed by the Inquisition. The major objection actually came from a professor of natural philosophy, Cesare Cremonini, who was just down the hall from Galileo and was objecting based on ancient wisdom. The first religious based objection was actually from the mother of one of Galileo's students, the Grand Duchess Christina. Her objection was polite because she had some vague idea that the Bible concurred with ancient wisdom, but Galileo explained he found no contradiction that he knew of. The story of how Galileo ended up in front of the Inquisition was simply a matter of legal abuses rather than religious zealotry. This is Renaissance era Florence, which was ruled by a checkerboard of landowning aristocrats and franchise based corporations. The highest court in the land was known as the Grand Master, held by the House of Medici, who was both the biggest corporation and the biggest landlord. But the Medici were the ones funding Galileo's research, so no one in these lawsuits ever bothered with them. But the Grand Master of Florence would decline Galileo's request to intervene in the church courts when they came up. The only other, and the reason church courts were used, because they were the only other court in the land with the authority to suppress publication of anything. But they would only intervene in matters directly concerning the church. So Galileo's critics literally had to make a religious issue out of this if they were going to censor them. Now, the religious argument they made simply came from the part of the Bible where God is said to move the sun backwards, and they said this implied the sun was movable and not the center of the universe. And this was used to call Galileo a heretic repeatedly, even though they never even bothered charging him with that, because no one actually wanted Galileo dead. They just wanted him suppressed his work. Of course, the fairly obvious counter-argument to that is that God does what he wants, so there's no contradiction to work with here. Perhaps the strangest part of the story is we're actually not sure why the courts sided with the prosecution. There's one theory that there was papal interference in the courts because Pope Urban was tied up in European wars of religion and Italian wars that had nothing to do with religion. The popes at this time ruled much of central Italy, and his neighbors in Florence, the House of Medici, were not his friends, even though they were also Catholic. We do know one of the theologians adjudicating this dispute was the Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, and he was of the opinion that Galileo was not a heretic, but his book needed to be edited to erase any real or imagined perceived contradictions. There was also the Monsignor Francesco Ignoli, who argued against Galileo for scientific reason, despite he's making these arguments despite being a theologian, and he gave the same argument the ancient Greeks did, that in order for the stars to fit into Galileo's theory, they have to be unimaginably large and unimaginably far away in order to have zero parallax shift detected. It's also not clear how many people took the charges against Galileo seriously because he was imprisoned and then that prison sentence was commuted to house arrest by another archbishop. Of course, it's easy to see how the Pope's possible motive for interfering would have also applied to a lot of men, between the egotistical bastards at the university and paranoia of insider threats. It's easy to see how a freak incident like what happened to Galileo could happen. You actually see similar incidents in when bodies of men are set up to adjudicate academic, and often the deciding factor has actually nothing to do with the science at hand. It should also be noted that most other astronomers at the time did not face any legal issues for their work, whether it be Newton or Kepler or several others.